Thank you. At the risk of repeating myself from Monday, I wanted to say that when we speak of translation, we often think of words, sentences, or other semantic units that make sense or not make sense to the translator or the reader. Or on the practical side, one could be instrumental with regard to words with translation. Does it work? Does it not work? I wanted to emphasize often the unsaid or the silences surrounding the common assumptions. These assumptions is often the place to start to ask new questions about translation or any proposition about it. Okay, so here's what so I'm not taking an instrumental approach. I wanted to ask, what philosophical work can the study of translation perform for the human sciences? All right, so these are the things that interest me. I have to confess that I keep my distance from translation studies. I'm not a scholar of translation studies. I just bump into it because precisely there's the potential to do philosophical work and also historical work, which I will bring up on Friday. That the study of translation can perform for the human sciences. It can do things like asking new questions, like epistemological questions, ethical questions, and political questions. I'm going to focus on these last two on Friday. And then there is the opportunity to develop analytical methods beyond the communication model, of which I had some discussion last time in regard to the statistical machine, and beyond the theological model that emphasizes the plenitude of meaning. Is it possible to, now my question is it possible to speak of translation not just in terms of semantics? So this is where I come from. All right. Last time I spoke of the threshold of sense and nonsense as a problem of probability in regard to the rise of information theory through Claude Shannon's work, and also in relation between letter and number. So there was this emphasis on number, which led us into the problem of probability, which it turns out governs the relationship between sense and nonsense at the level of the unconscious of language, all right, which is always social, not talking about the brains. And that turns out to be related to the ratio of information entropy and redundancy. So you've already heard that. I'm not going to do more discussion like that. And then that discussion should lead to some reflections on the disjuncture among word, concept, and letter. And these are very different categories. I wanted to emphasize this because it's not usually what we focus on as we think about language and as we think about translation. I don't want to collapse the two. All right, so then the title of this talk is What Happens When Translation Puts X in Motion. I'm not going to say what the X is, so it could be anything you have you can call up in your mind, X emotion. But I'm going to do a thought experiment. I have my X in mind, and that I can share with you. Okay, so let's experiment with this. I think we've been hearing discussions of translations of oral units or written units, right? So that's what we usually get. Word or sentence, the X could be word or sentence, a concept, which we usually say ideas. Any kind of cultural idiom if we wanted to emphasize difference. But I'm not going to focus on these things. What I'm going to focus on is script, and I'm going to ask some questions, really push the limits of thinking about translation, raising the question of the script, asking, is the script the ultimate incommensurable? Since commensurability has been such a problem for translation studies. Okay, so last week I focused on number in relation to nonsense, and this week nonsense is not going to receding to the back. It's going to come back to hounders. And translators, and you're probably translators, tend to be paranoid about the place of nonsense in our translation, because we try very hard to keep nonsense at bay so that we can make sense, like be intelligent, making things intelligible, right? So what we're really struggling very hard, speaking of psychic struggle, is to do battle against nonsense and chaos and all of that. So I wanted to keep that in our conversation as we move to our my next topic, script. So the question, does the script travel where ideas move about or cross linguistic boundaries? What gets left behind? And of course, the easy answer is that the script gets left behind. Right? The script, so that what passes through. And usually people say ideas. So then what are ideas? These disembodied entities. And there are a lot of philosophical issues one would have to deal with before we can speak of what goes through, what does not. All right, so these are the issues that really concern me. And before we get to the script, there has been a lot of confusion over the identity of the material sign. We attach certain images to certain signs. And last time I already brought it up, I said I would address it this time on Wednesday. And so I'm going to address it head on. That is, I'm going to ask us to make a distinction between language, writing system, and script, because usually there is confusion over these three terms, which can lead to unfruitful discussions of translation. If we collapse the script with language, then what are we doing? Okay. Example, one language can be written in two scripts. And here, Hindi and Urdu would be very good examples. And then you could have one script writing many languages. The Roman alphabet, the Hanzi, which people usually call Chinese, and that is not. That doesn't work very well as an analytical concept. It's just folk wisdom. Whatever we identify as Chinese. So strictly Hanzi, this is the kind of script we're talking about in parallel to the alphabet or Latin alphabet and other scripts. So, and so I'm not going to collapse a writing system with a script. I think I had a little bit of a discussion of James Joyce's work with many writing systems within one book, Finnegan's Wake. These writing systems share a script, which is the Latin script. All right. By the way, I said the first sentence was actually on the first page of Finnegan's Wake. Has that nonsense letter sequence, and Sherry corrected me that yes, the first sentence is river run, which is also the last sentence. Okay. And in any case, so I hope we're getting this at least clear at some preliminary level. Okay, I wrote a piece for Mitchell and Hansen's edited book called Critical Terms of Media Studies, and they asked me to write an entry on writing, and I did, where I clarify these the distinctions. I just wanted to share this with you. So this is where I come from. I'm interested in the problem of media technology, and that's where I think about the distinctions among language, writing systems, and scripts. All right? Okay, so this is the thought experiment. So instead of going to mathematicians this week, today, I'm going to artists. And I think artists can give us a lot of things to think about as to what we're doing as scholars. So this, I took this, these two icons from the work of an artist named Xu Bing, a very well-known artist who lives in Brooklyn and Beijing, back and forth. And he used ready-made, and in this case, found pictographs in today's popular culture to write a book called A Book from the Ground. The book is a novel published by the MIT Press, consisting of entirely these icons. Okay, so instead of working with language, writing, or script, we then approach them from an artist's point of view. That is, we start with our favorite icons that people use today to communicate. All right? So then I'm taking the sign on the right, and then we'll ask some questions. And so this is this captures what I'm going to do today. Okay. About the book. You are all familiar with Chartier's work. What is a book? Whether they are in manuscript or in print, books are objects whose forms, if they cannot impose the sense of the text that they bear, at least command the users that can invest them and the appropriations to which they are susceptible. Works and discourses exist only when they become physical realities and are inscribed on the pages of a book, transmitted by a voice reading or narrating or spoken on the stage of a theater. Here he's referring to multiple mediums here, so we're not talking about content. But then it's not to make a distinction between content and form, which could be extremely limiting. We're talking about the materiality of the medium. Now, I wanted to also raise some questions about Chartier's image of the book. This is, okay, what is this? A book within a book? Well, yes. Book about, okay, it's a meta book? Okay, it's just an image. It's an image of a meta concept of a book. Okay, so this seems very interesting. So we need to think about the image of the book. So there are several things going on. The concept of writing and the materiality of the medium. So there are many pieces to that. I started with the image, and then we need to think of the book in relation to the concept of writing, and then materiality of the medium. Over the past few days, I heard many presentations that would give us a manuscript, right, fragments, and these are very concrete objects. And they're, whether we're talking about parchment, we're talking about papaya, we're talking about paper, these are very, very different mediums. And I'm going to introduce a Chinese concept, in terms of a Chinese written character, and which one could translate as what? Could someone give me a translation? The book? Okay. Okay. So immediately when you insist on the translation, you come up with one term. So again, the problem of number 1 to 1, right? But what if we think of this concept as a conceptual assemblage consisting of many things? So what if we just have this thought experiment of playing with many other pieces of this concept? It's pronounced shu. It is as an object, as inscription. If one were to take the etymological route, I'm not going to do that, but other scholars would tell you shu means writing, inscription, as well as a verb, as a noun. It could mean the book, right? And shu as technology, always when it's associated with printed object, right? See, we're dealing with at least 3 different things. And so I'm not going to call it a word. For convenience, you could call shu a character, but then I'm going to play, since this is the thought experiment, with the idea of a conceptual assemblage. So this is where we're going to start. Okay, so our translation, the idea of translation would have to be somehow reworked through this conceptual assemblage, and this is what I'm going to do today. All right. And then to give you a sense of assemblage, Ted Nelson, as some of you are know, was the one who invented the idea of hypertext, who is profoundly disillusioned with the development of World Wide Web, with especially and with softwares, word processing softwares that imitate the physical book on the website, on your computer screen, giving you the illusion, optical illusion that you're still reading a page, right? And so Ted Nelson, when he first studied in the 70s, he was thinking of a future writing network in these terms. See, document servers, you have user console network is potentially unlimited in size. And so you were not really talking about one thing, right? So not unified book. We're talking about a network involving so many things, okay? Just like the Chinese concept, that assemblage, we can lead you in many directions, right? I'm just bringing these two together so we can think about the past as well as the future in terms of where we are in thinking about writing, script, and language. So more about concept. This is I'm taking you, instead of through the Latin etymological root, translatio, I'm taking you through the Chinese concept as a theoretical concept, this conceptual assemblage, to take you in some other directions so we can continue with our thought experiment. So what is a shu? An object with 2-dimensional surfaces that may bear writing or other visual and spatial inscription. So this is the first possibility. That is the shu. Okay. I don't think you could find a English term that can bear the weight of the conceptual analysis that I'm doing here. So we must rely on the Chinese character as the conceptual basis. A medium open to technological innovation and remediation. So again, I'm taking this shu not to the past, but to the future, all right? Consider it as medium, and also consider it as the inscription consisting of codes, mimex. Those of you who are in digital studies, you know mimex, hypertext, instant access, or networks. All right, so let's think about shu in all those terms for the future. Keep that in play. All right, so Now, there are people, artists who do other things. Huang Yongping decided to place 2 textbooks, Chinese art history and a concise history of modern Western art, into a washing machine and wash them for 2 minutes, and this is what you get. All right. So you can do things with Shu in all sorts of ways. Okay. And this is the visual and physical equivalent of nonsense, rendering something into nonsense to reveal its essence, right? So this is art history. Art historians, artists' reflections on their own field. And I think what we need to do in translation studies is also to do something like this. Put it in the washing machine and run it for 2 minutes and see what you get. The pulp, a different object, right? So that should be fun. Now, I really wanted to introduce next this idea of Shu as an object through Xu Bing's work. I mentioned Xu Bing's work, but the work that really distinguishes him from people like Huang Yongping and other contemporary West European and American artists is this book, The Book from the Sky. And what is this book? He invented 4,000 nonsense Chinese characters, or Hanzi, and he carved them and printed them as movable types, 4,000. He spent many years doing that to produce something very beautiful. Something very beautiful. And this is the work, Tian Shu, that is the book from the sky, that he exhibited at MoMA, many places in London, Berlin, around the world. He's an extremely important contemporary artist who is really in touch with what we're doing. Philosophical, I read him alongside Derrida. And I think sometimes he goes even further than Derrida. So we need to go to Xu Bing's work and think about what writing is, what medium is, right? What a book is. So essentially, and he created, why did he create 4,000 characters? This is the cover, this is the wood block that he carved, and the image of a wood block. And for those of you who know Chinese characters, I wonder if you can recognize a single one of them. No. When Xu Bing first exhibited his work in Beijing, there were actually many scholars who brought their magnifying glasses with them, and they would go one by one. They were so paranoid about not being able to find a single legible character with which they could identify. They were complete, and for some of them, it was almost a nervous breakdown, because what happened to all their education? You know, literacy basically defines their social status. But all of a sudden, they were confronted with characters like bound books and movable types, characters which they couldn't identify or recognize. All right. So what Xu Bing does is to introduce this uncertainty between a book and a non-book. So then he really makes us think about the identity of a book. Along with it, is the book defined by writing? If the characters are nonsense characters, does the book qualify as a book? Okay, so everything we feel comfortable with as people with literacy, well-educated people, crumbles. When we come into there's an encounter. So then, at the least, he introduces the internal split in the conceptual assemblage of the Shu, which we often, take for granted. Okay, so those 4,000 fake characters then bring to question the very idea of a book. Now, nonsense characters then serve as a hinge, as the interplay between object and inscription. It turns out that we usually associate the book with some kind of inscription that those who have been schooled in that script would be able to interpret. There's no way you can interpret Xu Bing's characters. So that's the limit, all right? And Jacques Derrida of Grammatology says, the idea of the book, which always refers to a natural totality, is profoundly alien to the sense of writing. It is the encyclopedic protection of theology and of logocentrism against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy, and as I shall specify later, against difference in general. So he's really talking about the problem of écriture in relation to the philosophical traditions represented by Hegel, Saussure, and and Heidegger. So this is Derrida tries to also push back against our familiar image of the book in relation to writing, but Xu Bing does something more radical than this, because Xu Bing was not burdened with the critique of Western metaphysics. Why should he? But then, in order to understand what Xu Bing is doing, we really need to clarify some of the misconceptions existing among these familiar lines like boundaries. What is a phonetic alphabet? What is a pictograph? What is an ideograph? And differences among the writing systems. And we work with them all the time as translators. Language, script, and writing system, I've emphasized again, at least there are other distinctions. We need to make a three-way distinction here, right? So I would not, let's see, I think we should suspend the distinction among the alphabet, pictograph, and the ideograph for the purpose of this discussion. They're not very helpful, okay? Not only because Chinese characters are not pictographs, contrary to common opinion. They're very, that's the basic ignorance. Okay. Now, here is Xu Bing's bound volume. Everything, including the font type, including the layout of the page, including the way the sheets are bound together, everything conforms to what a good practice in bookmaking consists of. And Xu Bing is a master printmaker. He trained in the Central Academy of Fine Arts in the department, the print department. So this was his background. But then he was crazy enough to invent these fake characters to challenge the very idea of the print world. Right? So this is the simulacra of a book, the simulacra of writing, Chinese writing. Okay, like this. Can anyone recognize these characters? A single character? No, I can't. But for those of you who don't know Chinese characters, you might think, well, this is Chinese, right? Okay, but they're not. So this is a play between what is Chinese character and a play on difference here. It's a false play. And this is what he puts in motion here. So then that takes us to the other piece about this conceptual assemblage, that shu as inscription. Okay, I'm going to take you to another one of Xu Bing's works, very prolific works. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to decide whether this is these are Chinese characters or not. If not, then what characters these are? There are 6 of them. They're Roman characters. Okay, that look like Chinese characters. Right. They're Latin. They're English. Okay, you already identified one since you had the training, you know, right? Okay, great. So sometimes when I speak to people and I identify these in 5 seconds, you can, you know, these are not Chinese characters. This is a work, it's Xu Bing's elaboration of Jabberwocky in translation. So that raises the question, can you translate a script? And this is a work he exhibited called Square Character Calligraphy, which he also calls New English Calligraphy. And he has been working with some Japanese font makers to introduce this font into the available computer fonts, but he hasn't been able to get it into circulation. But once I obtained his program, and I demonstrated it to my students, and I told them that could be a future font to use when they write their academic papers, to cause some difficulty with their professors, because their professor would not be able to read their papers in English in this font. Right? Okay, so what is he doing? I hear that some of you were able to identify some of the characters, right? So, so what are they? Go. Jew. Play. Ink. This is a very special group. Because you're very used to working with manuscripts. So this is, but then, so this raises the question, can you translate? Do you leave the script behind, or can you translate among scripts? But is this translation? Again, he pushes thinking about translation there. Something between English and Chinese characters. Now, these are, he produced a guide for the writing of his square character calligraphy for English. And so you see from left to right, vertically A, B, C, D, right? And children love this. And they don't have a mental block with this, and they immediately jump at this new writing and script. So Xu Bing plays with the pictographs, but these are not. They're simply strokes. They're elementary strokes used in the writing of the square character. You can quickly master it. In one of the exhibits, he staged a pedagogical moment where viewers are invited to do this kind of calligraphy sessions, tutorials, and they can teach themselves how to do this both with a brush and with the computer. So there are all these possibilities. You learn English from scratch again, right? So that this is almost a mirror image of the book from the sky, right? You reduce the literary English viewer to the status of illiteracy by compelling them to learn a new way of composing a word. It's not linear, but it's architectural, just like Chinese characters. These characters actually consist of 5-stroke system of square written characters. Instead of 26 letters, you have 5 strokes. So you have fewer. In fact, there's a computer input system called a 5-stroke system. So you can input characters faster because there are only 5. What are they? These are the 5. So then you can quickly put them together. And in the history of Chinese civilization, there were many new writing systems that were designed on the basis of this. Tangut, for example, writing was based on this system. It's not Chinese, right? Okay, and that stroke system is explained in Xu Shen's first dictionary of written Chinese characters, published in 100 year of the Common Era. So it was the first, I don't know if it's the world's first dictionary of writing, but it was the first dictionary of writing in Chinese. Okay, so Xu Bin basically designed his systems, including his other work, Book from the Sky, using a lot of this analytical tools, all right, like this. So that raises the question of possibility of translating scripts. And you might not call it translation, but it does raise some issues. So I actually call this work as Jabberwocky in New English Calligraphy. It raises questions about the translatable, untranslatable among scripts. And so that it means the Latin etymology of translation would have to be put aside, and as we think about what we actually carry across languages, right? There. Okay, and here is, since you're very good at it, can you identify this writing? This? Already give you a hint. That's Jabberwocky. So you use this Jabberwocky script to write Jabberwocky, to copy the verse, the first stanza of Lewis Carroll's. This was done by Xu Bin himself. I told him he should do this, so he wrote it and sent it to me. So he wrote the Jabberwocky verse, the first stanza, in his Jabberwocky script, a further play on the problem of sense and nonsense, and that very threshold occupied by script, which is this Latin script or square character script, or in between. So I think his work has philosophical implications for those of us who are interested in translation. So you've already identified, so I'm not going to just, I'm doing the on-site translation, but it's a translation script, not semantic translation here, right? So I'm just writing it out in two different scripts, and they look like translation, but they're not. So again, you have a further play on that conceptual limit of translation that we're talking about, right? The moment he introduced script into the problem, right? And he did many installations. This was one of them. This was one I think he did at Columbia University in the Warlock Gallery. He wrote a huge work, handwritten, for this exhibit, and you could also do it on the computer. Very innovative. So then, let's rethink writing as a system of verbal, visual, or spatial signs. Remember on Monday I talked about Shannon's adding of the 27th letter to the English alphabet, to his, more precisely, to printed English, and that additional letter is the space letter. All right. And the question of repetition, as you see in so many strokes, they're all 5 strokes coming out of 5-stroke system that are repeated according to the combinatorial logic of a particular system. We could talk about the alphabetical system. We could also talk about the Chinese stroke systems, and they involve the same kind of mathematical probability. I won't have the time to go into it. I actually work with a mathematician to figure out how many more Chinese characters we could produce out of the 5 strokes on top of the existing living ones. I mean, the characters people continue today use, thousands of them, and the dead ones, you know, the totality of them, like 90K. Well, English has more combinations of them, millions, right? And then we came up with a huge number. That is, you can create more characters using the 5 strokes. Okay, it's a combinatorial. Chinese characters are not pictures. The 5-stroke system works exactly like the 26-letter system, except that it's not linear. It has a different mode of combination as spatial signs, but it has the same kind of logic. And then when we think of them, we must include a consideration of technological reproducibility of the sign and the strokes too. In the early 20th century, when the typewriter was first introduced to Asia, this innovation led to a lot of controversial claims about the differences between alphabetical writing and Chinese writing or Japanese writing. So there are now historians working on typewriters. And the vast majority, almost all of the people who participated in the debate thought that the stroke system, the Chinese characters, were extremely backward, disadvantaged, because you cannot create enough fonts, right? Movable types to produce a news item in a newspaper as quickly as the simple system of Latin alphabet. And then, so this conversation just went on and on. So the backward script versus advanced script, you know, illogical script versus the logical script. Okay, there's a lot of stuff going on. The only person who pointed it out, the obvious, was John Pierce, whose name popped up once in my last lecture. And he was the Bell Labs, one of the scientists who worked closely with Shannon, who was responsible for the first satellite sent into the orbit. And he pointed out in the 70s that let's find out why Japanese Japanese fax machine companies produced more fax machines than any other companies combined. Some of you younger people are probably not familiar with a fax machine. And the fax machine in the 70s had an advantage over the typewriter because you could, it was extremely useful by law firms and signatures because certain visual forms are not discrete. And typewriters can only process discrete symbols. Or discrete in the sense, computer scientists use the concept, mathematicians use discrete numbers, right? So John Pierce said the fax machine that the Japanese produced really revolutionized our thinking about technological reproducibility, in the sense that it's not the characters, traditional Chinese or kanji characters, the Japanese call them, that are backward. Before the invention of the fax machine, it was the typewriter that was backward, because it was not complicated enough to process complex signs, non-discrete signs. So that basically, evaporates. You don't hear people today talking about Chinese characters as backward system. How come it just disappeared, that whole argument? Because the computer comes in and enables it has this, wonderful computational ability to process complex signs, including visual, all kinds of visual signs. And so then that whole argument about the, superiority, inferiority for writing system is gone, which shows that Peirce really had an insight about this when he said the typewriter was backward compared with fax machine and the computer. And Alan Turing, who invented the computational idea, had a terrible time doing handwriting. And so he was always predisposed to the typewriter. And his handwriting was so illegible that he got a bad grade in school on his mathematical work, because the teacher couldn't recognize, distinguish, didn't know what to make of his writing. So this is just an anecdote. And so he basically designed the computer on the model of typewriter, and he says, the typewriter can write, but it cannot read. What if we designed a system that could also read and write? And there you go. He published that seminal essay in the 30s that really laid the ground for computational work, right? So both Shannon and Alan Turing, the two of them, revolutionized the entire field of communication studies. All right. So we come to Shu as technology. Remember, I thought we should consider this as conceptual assemblage, thinking of Shu as object, as inscription, as technology. And we've had a lot of discussion on what happens when writing migrates from print to electronic media. Marshall McLuhan says the content of a medium is always another medium, which makes very good sense. But he also said a lot of nonsense about Chinese characters and the, the wonderful superiority of the alphabetical symbols. But in any case, so to come to the conclusion of my talk, so I started with what happens when X travels. Then the next question, what difference does translation make to the movement of X in the form of assemblage, which we call Shu in Chinese? So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.